I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story. And like all stories, it has a beginning and an end. Wait, it doesn't have an end. So when you're ready, sitting comfortably, let's begin. Imagine it's around midnight and inside your home, everyone is sleeping. It's not much of a home, but it is near the factory where you work and where right at this moment, men, friends and colleagues have been fighting with increasing desperation to stop a leak of gas. They fail and the unimaginable happens. A tank explodes, tank 610. As the gas seeps into your home, you awaken with your eyes stinging and streaming. Quickly, you awake your partner, children and parents and urge them still sleepy out of the house where a dreadful scene awaits. Neighbors from homes nearer the factory are thronging the streets, running for their lives. You see the bodies of people and animals scattered on the ground, can't tell if they're alive or dead. You run with your family through the opaque cloud, desperately trying to keep everyone together, but already one of your parents has fallen, stumbling blindly over those scattered bodies. You know where and will come back after you, after everyone else to safety. You never return. Many of your friends and family will die this day. More than 10,000, they say. Pregnant women will abort their babies, many in the middle of the street. Hospitals can't cope with thousands of emergency cases. Bhopal, December 1984. Unimaginable? And yes, and unfortunately also unimagined. But it was in the newspapers, radio and TV. No internet back then. And then some years later, in 2010, I was looking for something more challenging for my life when I read a leaflet. Volunteer, I read, in the UK or Bhopal, which is here. I had thought that it was all done and dusted. But in 2011, when I arrived in Bhopal's, my lessons really began. Yes, December 1984. And this is what it looks like now. But more than 10,000 dead, did I say? How do I know? Well, in the next few days, Hindus bought about 8,000 cremation cloths. It's unlikely that Muslims fared any better. There were certainly more of them working in the factory at the time and living in the area. And then there are, of course, eyewitnesses still living. One man has recalled how he was part of a team that drove lorries around the body, picking up the body, drove lorries around the city, picking up the bodies. There were 8 lorries and each carried about 120 people, and they loaded it 5 times a day and worked for 4 days. That alone is 19,200 dead people. And then the military took over and continued to the task, and the count is lost. There'd been a Muslim festival, Ishtema. How many died in the railway or the bus station, on their way home, or in their villages later? We do not know and never will. There were mass burials, mass cremations, or bodies were dumped in the river. And before you criticize that, everyone working on that would have been sick. They would have had family members, friends lost en masse. And it is hot in Bhopal, even in early December, and the risk of diseases from decaying bodies would have been quite high. Of course, the numbers of the dead and injured are highly disputed in any incident like this, more related to politics and social considerations than they are to truth and investigation, or of course money and insurance. The first official government figures were 3,000, and it was raised a few years ago, but it's still only set at 5,000. I didn't know any of that on my first visit, yet I thought I knew about the accident. I learned many things. I learned that a disaster like Bhopal doesn't end for the people who live there. It doesn't end when the media lose interest. It just doesn't end. I learned that just as they were beginning to come to terms with their new life some years later, a second disaster was discovered. Ever since the factory had opened, poor disposal of waste had polluted the soil with toxic chemicals, which had permeated through the ground, poisoning the water they were using for washing, for cooking, and that they were drinking. I learned that the effects of the gas and the water are being passed down the generations from damaged chromosomes and weakened immune systems, and I personally experienced it when I treated a third-generation baby boy. I know it's difficult for us to understand about any incident without visiting, seeing, and experiencing, and even then, none of us can live it. A couple of years ago, I mentioned Bhopal to a conference organizer who answered, I know all about that. I replied, I thought that too, until I went there. So let me introduce you to a few of the people that I've met. Aziza still has flashbacks. In her own words, she's written, Mohsin, that was her little baby boy. Mohsin was being sick all over me. Then to my shame and horror, I felt myself having a miscarriage right there in the middle of the street. I couldn't control my bowels and feces ran down my leg, mixing with the blood. Well, Mohsin died, as did young Ruby, her daughter, who was running beside her, and some years later, her husband as well, from sickness caused by the gas and the water. She had been brought up traditionally as a Muslim woman, been little out of the home, but she trained as a nurse and now works in the clinic Sambhavna, where I also go, mostly in the gynecological section for her. Some half of all pregnancies were aborted that night, and in the following few days, they will not be included in the death stats. Khalil, he would have been 42 in 1984, one of my early patients. I think that's on the second trip I made. And he would be drinking that polluted water for all those years before, of course. He'd been a long patient in Sambhavna. He'd had a heart attack a year or two before this. I've not seen him for a few years. He was a lovely man. I often used to bump into him on my first few visits in the canteen. I've not seen him. He may well have died or be confined to his home by now. Nabil Singh, these thin legs have walked the 750 kilometers to Delhi to protest at the lack of government action. There have been 2 marches to Delhi since 1984, in fact. He'd had a session on the oxygen, which is a common requirement for people with respiratory problem in Bhopal. And he wandered over to me afterwards as I was waiting for a late client and asked me to rub some Ayurvedic oil on his arms. And I also did those legs when he sat down, as you can see. There are also younger people, of course, like Sunil, who was a babe in arms carried by his grandfather and is now a strapping young man, even if he does have a somewhat weak foot, which I was working on. I looked up from his treatment one day in one session to see him half sitting up and taking a video of me with his smartphone. He wanted to show his dad. Well, last December, I'm recording this in early 2022, was the 37th anniversary. So young people like him, like Inamal, like Afzal, and many others are still in their late 30s and early 40s. They have a life to live in which they're likely slowly to get worse and possibly give birth to increasing numbers of disabled children. But okay, I can hear you thinking already, that's all very well, Ian, and it's a terrible story, but what relevance does it have in our lives today? Well, I thought something similar back in 2011 before that first visit of mine. Then I asked when I was there, why didn't I know about all this? An incident that I thought I had known about. And then, if I didn't know about this, what else haven't I heard about that I didn't know about and that I didn't even know that I didn't know about? So I started looking, and I think I may have become a bit obsessed. To illustrate what I found, I'm going to give you a quick sprint through some of the things I found with the next few slides. Starting with nuclear, many incidents. Again, every slide, there's far, far more than I can get on one slide. You'll remember most of these, I'm sure. What about mercury? Does anybody remember either of those two at the top? And we've got the long-term effects at the bottom there. Then we've got pharmaceuticals. Again, many, many more that I can't even begin to go into. You'll all remember thalidomide, I'm sure, and the vaccine disputes. Then we've got mining, and even today in 2022, there's an average of 100 mining deaths in deep mines there every year. 100 deaths every year. I guess many people did not hear about that last one in Russia in November 2021. We don't hear about these things. Petrochemical, there are far too many to mention. And it's worth noting that in the USA alone, there's approximately 200 pipeline incidents every year. That's leaks and fires. They're not all major, of course not. Some are quite minor, but altogether they add up. And just think, if that's in the USA, which is better than most countries, think what's going on in all those countries where the pipelines run through them from far eastern edge of Russia. Then the biggest polluter of oil is, in fact, the military. And in fact, most of it by the American military, I have to say. And remember the bomb testing that took place in the 1940s and 50s? Marshall Islands are still suffering from leaking storage sites for that. Then we have things that we think maybe are not lethal. We don't think of them as being lethal. Some aren't, but I would ask you to think a little bit about these ones on this slide here in that regard. Then we've got electronic. Everybody watching this is probably fiddling with their smartphone as I talk about it. We are getting surrounded by electrosmog, increasing by the years and by more and more surveillance. Finance, been going on for decades and maybe even longer than decades, centuries, and it will carry on. So even the smaller ones affect people's lives, like Patisserie Valerie here in the UK. Financial mismanagement is the simple explanation to that. And who remembers Enron in 2001? Again, a big tale of financial mismanagement, and Dieselgate only in 2015. We need to look behind these things to see what's going on and what's causing them. Then finally, we can just have something that I can call Only Humanity. And do watch that that film down at the bottom, The Whistleblower, or read the book. The film is actually quite good. I could spend over an hour just listing them, giving you some headlines, and let alone telling you about some of the details of some of these incidents. But what could we do to reduce them? That's the question I always ask. And I do acknowledge that there have been some improvements over the years in some industries. And there are other incentives like B Corp with genuine good intent, at least to begin with. But there's also an abundance of greenwashing and even outright lies. I would cite Volkswagen in this, and the famous mistake in 2015. This was on their website at the time. It disappeared strangely in the next couple of weeks. I went looking for it again. Fortunately, I'd copied it. I think they forgot it, didn't they? So what can we do? The first thing we can do is to stop calling them accidents. They're not actually accidents. The cause is the social, political, financial, and economic systems that we have helped to build, that we support with our money, even that we worship, some of us, and okay, we do complain about as well. Then we must stop looking to place a blame. Blame never solves anything. It just diverts the attention, and that is often why it's using. In Volkswagen's case, they after they'd done the denial, which is again a common thing. There's a pattern with all these things: denial first, and then blame. Volkswagen's case, as I was saying, that was two engineers who didn't even work for the company. I think they must have thought we were stupid when we heard them claim that. And then after the denial and the blame, comes sometimes confession. When they can't divert the attention, then they have to confess. And sometimes, as a result of that, there will be some punishment occasionally. Maybe just the CEO gets moved or sacked. That's often the common one. And following that, there might even be some repercussions. It happens less frequently. Did happen a little bit in Bhopal, but to a very minor extent. But they've never accepted the blame. So we need some independent investigation. We need to, as I said earlier, we need to look behind these things that are happening. The best industry in this probably is the commercial airline industry with their black box and independent investigations. But it's not perfect, since at least one pilot captain killed himself after being blamed for a near miss near Heathrow. And the Boeing 737 MAX just a couple of years ago went through exactly that same process that I've just described with Volkswagen and others. So we need to change the culture. The culture, first of all, in companies, because it has to be okay to say, I made a mistake. It needs to be safe to blow the whistle. And we need to bring ethics into decision-making, not just money. But we also need to think wider than that. We need to change the culture in our society as well, in ourselves, in other words. Forgive me for the next slide. I'm allowed one, I think, but we are all responsible for these things in some way or another, small or big. How many of you have got a Teflon pan, maybe an old one, in your garage being used for something else? Yeah, that's so we need to think about those things and how we need to change as well. So we also need to make effective regulation. And to be effective, regulation has to have appropriate punishment to the companies themselves, something that means something to them, not something that's a week's profit. And it needs inspections, and it needs to have inspectors that are well paid, so they're not bribable. And it needs to have reparations. As a friend of mine in Bhopal, Sanjay, who was orphaned at 6 months old, has written, without consequences, nothing will change. So that's all to be very brief in this short talk, but I want to return finally for the last few minutes to Bhopal, because there's another clinic I haven't yet mentioned. Chingari is a clinic for children. None was alive in 1984, of course, and none had any responsibility, but all have been condemned to live through the legacy of that. I work aside 3 physiotherapists, Sanjay, Rishi, and Huma on the right, and in the many children. I often fill in when they have a day off, one of them, or somebody is sick. The workload is very varied, as are the children, from babies, young children, young adults. Some are hyperactive, difficult to hold their attention. Some are the absolute opposite. Some have flaccid muscles, floppy ones, and some have severely spasmed muscles. So it's a lot of different work. And so let's look at some of the older people I've worked with. Father here in the white at the back is Ayub. He had 2 sons, both with muscular dystrophy, which is quite common. It's a male oriented illness. And they both died a couple of years, in the last couple of years, in fact, Umar and Azar. Here we see Abdullah. He has cerebral palsy. As you can probably see from his eyes, he's a little bit unsteady on his feet. He's probably 20 or so now. And I'm told that he rides a bicycle around Bhopal and frequently falls off. I give him exercises, mainly exercises. I can do a little work on him, but he's a little bit too fidgety to keep working body work for very long. Then we have Manan. Manan is also cerebral palsy. It's probably the most common or commonly diagnosed condition. However, he's very intelligent. CP doesn't always affect the brain severely. Very bright young lad. He speaks English, so we can actually communicate. You can see from the picture on the right that his problem is mainly in his pelvis and legs. In fact, it takes him about 15 minutes to walk from the front of the clinic where he is there round to the treatment room, which is probably less than 20 meters away. Always cheery though, always got a joke for everybody. And this is Khaled, one of the worst affected by cerebral palsy, here with his mum. He arrives on a scooter every day, sandwiched in between his mum at the back and his dad at the front who's driving. His mum gets off and walks backward to bring him in. That's probably his most relaxed position. There's no way we can communicate with him in that way. So yes, the story began one December night in 1984. When will it end? For any research you'd like to do yourself, the Bhopal Medical Peer website is here. If you want a copy of either of the 3 months in Bhopal or Bhopal Diary or my books, contact me and you can get some information about those. And the other 3 are recommended books to read. The first 2 particularly I've read. I must admit I've not read the last one, but it's a very popular, well-run, well-written book.